They thought she had no one watching. But in that quiet moment, everything was already in motion. The morning light poured through the wide glass windows of the downtown bank, casting long, pale reflections across polished marble floors as customers stood in line, checking their phones, signing forms, and waiting for their turn without realizing how quickly the atmosphere was about to shift. Officer Ryan Blake adjusted his stance near the entrance, his hand resting confidently near his belt as his eyes scanned the room with quiet authority, convinced he had everything under control. Across from him stood Evelyn Carter, an elderly woman with a calm posture and steady hands, holding a simple bank folder against her chest as if it were something more than just paper, something worth protecting. She didn't speak much, only nodding politely as the teller called her name. But something about her stillness drew attention, not in a loud or disruptive way, but in a quiet, undeniable presence that lingered longer than expected. Ryan stepped forward, his voice firm but controlled, asking her to stop, his tone suggesting he had already made up his mind before hearing her response. Evelyn turned slowly, her eyes meeting his without fear, only calm understanding, as if she had seen this moment coming long before it happened. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, carrying a quiet dignity that seemed to momentarily disrupt the officer's certainty. Around them, the room began to change, subtle at first, people pausing, glancing over, sensing tension without fully understanding its source. Ryan's expression tightened as he asked for identification, his voice becoming more clipped, more insistent, while Evelyn reached calmly into her bag and retrieved her documents, placing them gently on the counter. Behind the glass, unnoticed by most, a man in a worn leather vest watched closely, his gaze fixed not on the officer, but on the woman standing so calmly under pressure. Marcus Reed didn't move, didn't interrupt, but his presence alone shifted something in the atmosphere, like a quiet signal waiting for the right moment. Ryan flipped through the documents quickly, his suspicion deepening as he scanned every detail, every name, every signature, as if searching for something that would confirm his assumptions. Evelyn remained still, her hands folded, her eyes forward, not reacting to the growing tension around her. Outside, a faint rumble echoed in the distance, subtle enough to go unnoticed by most. But Marcus heard it, his expression changing just slightly, as if acknowledging something already in motion. Inside, Ryan placed the documents down with a firm tap, stepping closer as the room grew quieter, the air heavier, the moment stretching as if time itself was holding its breath. And in that silence, with everything still unresolved, one question lingered in the space between them. What happens when the person you chose to question is the one who has already been watching you? The quiet inside the bank seemed to stretch longer than anyone expected as Officer Ryan Blake stood just a few feet from Evelyn Carter, his eyes narrowing slightly while he studied her documents with a growing sense of unease he could not quite explain. Around them, customers shifted in place, some pretending not to watch, others unable to look away, their attention caught by the subtle tension that was beginning to build in the center of the room. Evelyn remained still, her hands resting gently on the counter, her posture unchanged, her expression calm in a way that did not match the rising discomfort in the air. Ryan tapped the documents once against the desk, his voice lower now as he questioned a small detail, something most people would have ignored, but he held on to it, as if it confirmed something in his mind. "These records do not match the system," he said, his tone firm but not yet aggressive, as he turned slightly to signal the teller to assist him, though his eyes never left Evelyn for long. The teller hesitated, unsure, glancing between them as she tried to remain professional while sensing the shift unfolding in front of her. Evelyn spoke again, her voice steady and composed, explaining her purpose at the bank, her words measured, clear, and without hesitation. Yet Ryan's expression remained guarded, his posture tightening as if he had already decided which version of the truth he was willing to accept. Across the room, Marcus Reed leaned forward just slightly, his presence still quiet but undeniably focused, his attention fixed on Evelyn, then shifting briefly to the officer, as if connecting pieces that no one else in the room could see. Outside, the distant rumble grew slightly louder, subtle enough that most people inside the bank had not noticed it yet. But Marcus did, his jaw tightening. as he recognized the sound, though he made no move to react. Ryan took a step back, his hand resting closer to his side as he spoke into his radio in a low voice, requesting a quick verification, his patience thinning as the situation refused to resolve the way he expected. Evelyn's gaze followed him, not with fear, but with a quiet awareness, as though she understood that the moment was shifting into something more complicated than a simple misunderstanding. The customers in line had now turned fully toward the scene, their silence no longer passive, but attentive, as the atmosphere inside the bank grew heavier with each passing second. Ryan returned his focus to Evelyn, his voice steady but more assertive now, asking her to remain in place while they continued verifying her information, his tone suggesting control even as doubt began to surface. Evelyn gave a slight nod, complying without resistance, her calm presence contrasting with the tension building around her, drawing more attention than any raised voice ever could. Marcus finally stood, not rushing, not drawing attention, simply adjusting his position so that he now stood closer to the entrance, his eyes moving between the officer and the glass doors as if waiting for something to arrive. The faint rumble outside grew clearer, more defined, the sound of engines growing stronger, though still distant enough to leave room for uncertainty. Inside, no one spoke, but everyone felt it, the shift, the tension, the sense that something larger was approaching, something that had not yet revealed itself. And as Ryan looked back down at the documents one more time, he did not realize that the moment he thought he controlled was already slipping beyond his reach. The sound outside the bank was no longer distant. It was present, a low and steady hum that seemed to settle into the walls and into the quiet minds of everyone inside, though no one dared to speak about it. Officer Ryan Blake stood straighter, his attention divided for the first time between the documents in his hands and the faint but growing sound beyond the glass doors. Evelyn Carter remained composed, her hands still resting calmly on the counter, her posture unchanged, yet something in the air had shifted around her, something that could not be seen but could be felt. Across the room, Marcus Reed stepped closer to the entrance, his movements measured and deliberate, his eyes locked forward as if counting the seconds until something unseen would arrive. Ryan looked up again, his patience thinning, his voice now carrying a sharper edge as he questioned Evelyn once more, asking her to confirm details that had already been verified, as if searching for a reason to justify his doubt. Evelyn responded without hesitation, her tone clear and steady, explaining her situation with the same calm precision as before, not raising her voice, not reacting to the pressure surrounding her. The teller beside her glanced nervously at Ryan, then at Evelyn, unsure of what she was witnessing, but certain that something important was unfolding. A few customers shifted in their places, exchanging glances, their earlier quiet curiosity now turning into a deeper sense of uncertainty. Then, a faint vibration passed through the glass, subtle at first, but undeniable, followed by the distant echo of engines growing closer, louder, more defined. Ryan paused, his head turning slightly toward the sound, his expression tightening as he realized it was no longer something he could ignore. Marcus did not move, but his focus sharpened, his stance steady as he watched the entrance with quiet intensity. The doors of the bank reflected the street outside, and beyond the reflection, faint shapes began to gather, large silhouettes forming in the distance, though still partially obscured. Inside, the tension rose, not through action, but through anticipation, through the growing awareness that something beyond the control of the moment was approaching. Ryan adjusted his position, placing one hand near his radio again, his confidence wavering just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath his authority. Evelyn finally shifted her gaze slightly, not toward the officer, but toward the doors, as if acknowledging the sound that others had only begun to notice. Marcus exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing just slightly, recognizing what was coming before anyone else inside the room fully understood. The sound grew louder, closer, until it filled the space between the walls and the glass, pressing into the silence and forcing every person inside to feel its presence. Ryan took a step forward, then stopped, his eyes fixed on the entrance, his authority challenged not by words, but by the undeniable arrival of something larger than the situation he believed he controlled. And as the sound reached its peak, The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment the doors would finally open and for the truth to step inside. The doors of the bank stood still for a long moment, as if the entire room had been frozen in anticipation of what lay beyond them, while the distant sound outside grew louder, clearer, and more present with each passing second. Officer Ryan Blake stood near the center of the room, his posture rigid but no longer fully confident, his attention locked on the glass entrance as the faint outlines outside began to sharpen into unmistakable shapes. Evelyn Carter remained at the counter, her hands steady, her breathing even, her presence unchanged, as though the approaching moment was not something to fear, but something she had already understood long before it arrived. Marcus Reed stood closest to the entrance now, his stance relaxed but intentional, his eyes scanning the glass doors with a calm focus that contrasted sharply with the rising tension around him. Inside the bank, customers began to sense the shift, their quiet unease turning into visible curiosity as they noticed the growing attention toward the entrance. Ryan adjusted his stance, his hand hovering near his radio, his authority still present, but now layered with hesitation he could not fully conceal. The sound outside grew stronger, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the tension building inside, until finally, the first shadow moved across the glass, followed by another, and then several more. Marcus exhaled slowly, his expression unchanged, as if confirming something he already knew. Evelyn turned her head slightly, her eyes now directed toward the doors, her calm demeanor never breaking, her composure standing in quiet contrast to the shifting energy around her. Ryan stepped forward just slightly, his voice lower now as he spoke into his radio, requesting confirmation, though his eyes never left the entrance. The teller stood still, her hands resting on the counter, her attention divided between Evelyn and the door, sensing that whatever was about to happen would change the direction of everything that had come before it. Then, without warning, the movement outside stopped. The sound of engines faded into silence, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than the noise that had come before it. Inside the bank, no one spoke. No one moved. Every person in the room seemed to be waiting for the same moment, the moment when the unknown would finally step forward. Ryan tightened his grip slightly, his posture stiffening as the silence stretched, each second feeling longer than the last. Marcus tilted his head just slightly, his eyes narrowing as if recognizing that the moment had arrived. And then, slowly, the doors began to move, just a fraction at first, a subtle shift that sent a ripple through the room, followed by the quiet creak of hinges breaking the silence. Every eye turned toward the entrance as the doors continued to open, revealing not just the street outside, but the presence of something far more powerful waiting to step inside. Evelyn did not flinch. She did not react. She simply stood, watching, as the truth began to enter the room. And in that moment, everything that had been building was finally about to be revealed. The doors of the bank opened slowly, and in that moment, time seemed to stretch as the outside world finally stepped into the room, bringing with it a presence that immediately shifted the atmosphere in ways no one could ignore. The first figure to appear wore a worn leather vest, his posture calm, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning the room with quiet precision as he stepped just inside the threshold and stopped. Behind him, more figures followed, each one dressed the same, their arrival silent but undeniable, filling the doorway without rushing, without noise, yet commanding attention in a way that felt natural and absolute. Marcus Reed did not move, but his expression changed slightly, a subtle confirmation passing through his gaze as he recognized the moment had fully arrived. Officer Ryan Blake noticed it too, though he did not yet fully understand what he was seeing, only that the dynamic of the room had shifted in a way that made his earlier confidence feel less certain. Evelyn Carter remained still, her eyes now calmly observing the group as they entered, her expression unchanged, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. One of the men from the group stepped forward slightly, his presence calm but authoritative, his gaze moving across the room before settling briefly on Ryan, then shifting toward Evelyn with a quiet acknowledgement. No one spoke at first. The silence that followed the door's opening was heavier than any sound that had come before it, as if the entire bank had paused to process what was unfolding. Ryan tightened his stance, his hand still near his radio. though he hesitated before speaking, his instincts warning him that this situation had shifted beyond his control. The man in the vest finally spoke, his voice calm and measured, asking a simple question that carried weight without needing force, asking about the woman at the counter. Evelyn turned her head slightly toward him, her posture still composed, her presence steady, as if confirming that she was exactly where she intended to be. The other men in the group remained near the entrance, their presence forming a quiet line between the outside world and the interior of the bank, creating a boundary that felt both physical and symbolic. Ryan's gaze moved between them, his authority now under quiet pressure, as he realized that the situation was no longer one he could control with procedure alone. The teller stepped back slightly, sensing the shift, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with a deeper awareness that something significant was unfolding. Marcus Reed finally spoke, his voice low but clear, addressing Ryan directly, not with hostility, but with certainty, as if stating something already understood. Ryan responded, his voice controlled but defensive, explaining his actions, trying to reassert his position, though the weight in the room made each word feel less certain than the last. Evelyn remained silent, watching, her calm demeanor standing in contrast to the tension between the two sides, her presence now central to everything happening around her. The man in the vest took a small step forward, not aggressive, but intentional, his gaze steady as he acknowledged Evelyn once more, then shifted back to Ryan, as if waiting for something to be clarified. The air inside the bank grew still again, not from fear, but from the quiet realization that the balance of power had changed, and that what would happen next would no longer be decided by authority alone, but by something deeper, something that had been waiting all along to reveal itself. The room inside the bank felt different now, not louder, but heavier, as if every breath taken carried more weight than before, and every movement was measured against a new, unseen standard. Officer Ryan Blake stood in the center, his earlier confidence now replaced with a controlled stillness, his eyes moving carefully between the men who had entered and the woman who had drawn their attention. Evelyn. Carter remained steady at the counter, her hands still resting gently on the surface, her posture unchanged, her calm presence anchoring the space around her. Marcus Reed stood near the entrance, his expression thoughtful, his attention now divided between the officer and the man who had stepped forward from the group, as if the next word spoken would determine the direction of everything that followed. The man in the vest spoke again, his voice even and calm, asking for clarification, not with force, but with quiet authority that suggested he was used to being heard. Ryan responded, attempting to maintain control, explaining his position, referencing procedure, and emphasizing his role, though his words carried less certainty than before. Around them, the customers remained silent, their earlier curiosity now replaced with a deeper awareness that they were witnessing something beyond a simple misunderstanding. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice gentle but clear, explaining her presence at the bank with precision, her words steady and without hesitation, as if she had rehearsed not the moment, but the truth itself. The man in the vest listened carefully, nodding once, acknowledging her explanation without interruption, his focus never wavering. Marcus took a slow step forward, his gaze now fully on Ryan, and for the first time, the room seemed to understand that the balance was no longer in the officer's favor. Ryan adjusted his stance, his hand still near his radio, though he did not speak into it, as if waiting for confirmation that might never come. The silence stretched, not empty, but full, filled with tension that required no movement to be felt. Evelyn turned slightly toward the group, her eyes calm, her expression unchanged, as if she were observing something already decided long before this moment began. The man in the vest exchanged a brief glance with Marcus, a silent communication passing between them that required no words, only understanding. Ryan's gaze followed that exchange, his awareness sharpening as he began to realize that this situation extended beyond what he had initially assumed. The teller stepped back another small step, her hands clasped together, her breathing quiet but uneven, sensing that the truth was beginning to shift into something visible. Evelyn's voice broke the silence again, not louder, but more certain, as she referenced details that connected her to a broader context, details that made the room subtly shift in understanding. Ryan's expression changed, just slightly, as pieces began to connect, though he resisted acknowledging what those connections implied. Marcus finally spoke again, his tone measured, not challenging, but confirming, as if reinforcing something that was already understood by those who had been watching. The man in the vest gave a small nod, acknowledging Marcus's words, then looked back at Ryan, his expression steady, his presence unwavering. Evelyn remained composed, her role in the moment becoming clearer without needing to assert it, her quiet strength defining the space around her. And as the weight of the truth settled into the room, it became clear that what had begun as a routine encounter had transformed into something far more significant, something that would not end with authority alone, but with accountability and the quiet certainty that the truth, once revealed, could no longer be ignored. The silence inside the bank had changed into something deeper, something that carried meaning rather than tension, as every person in the room seemed to understand that what was unfolding could not be reversed. Officer Ryan Blake stood still, his posture controlled but no longer dominant, his attention divided between the group in front of him and the realization that his authority was no longer absolute in this moment. Evelyn Carter remained at the counter, her presence unchanged, her calm expression now carrying a quiet certainty that reflected not fear, but understanding. Marcus Reed stood a few steps inside the entrance, his gaze steady, his stance relaxed, yet his presence filled the space in a way that suggested quiet command without the need for force. The man in the vest finally spoke again, his voice calm but clear, addressing Ryan directly, not with aggression, but with certainty that demanded acknowledgement. Ryan responded carefully, his words measured, attempting to maintain control by referencing policy and procedure, though his tone lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. Around them, the customers remained silent, their attention fixed on the exchange, their expressions shifting from curiosity to realization as the situation unfolded into something far more complex. Evelyn turned slightly, her voice calm as she spoke once more, clarifying her position with precise and measured language, each word reinforcing a truth that could not be easily dismissed. The man in the vest listened without interruption, his expression steady, his focus unwavering as he absorbed every detail. Marcus glanced toward Evelyn briefly, then back to Ryan, as if confirming that the moment had reached its turning point. Ryan adjusted his stance, his hand lowering slightly from the radio, his earlier certainty now replaced with cautious awareness, as though he understood that any misstep would carry consequences beyond what he had anticipated. The teller, standing nearby, clasped her hands together, her breathing quiet but uneven, sensing that what she was witnessing was no longer a simple interaction, but a moment of exposure. Evelyn's voice remained steady as she spoke again, this time referencing details that connected her identity to something larger, something that began to reshape how everyone in the room perceived her. A subtle shift passed through the room as her words settled, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a truth being acknowledged rather than revealed. Ryan's expression tightened, just slightly, as he processed the implications of what she had said, his resistance still present, but no longer as firm as before. Marcus stepped forward once more, closing the distance just enough to be heard clearly, his tone calm, his words deliberate, reinforcing the direction the moment was taking without raising his voice. The man in the vest gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the exchange, then shifted his attention back to Ryan, his gaze steady, his presence quiet but firm. The room seemed to breathe in unison, each person waiting for what would come next, as the balance of power continued to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Ryan looked between them, his composure intact on the surface, yet something beneath it had begun to change, as if he was beginning to realize that this situation was no longer defined by his authority alone. Evelyn remained composed, her posture unchanged, her calm presence continuing to anchor the moment as the truth settled into place. And in that quiet space, where no one raised their voice and no one moved without intention, it became clear that what had been hidden was now visible, and what had been controlled was now being questioned, as the room stood on the edge of a resolution that had been building from the very beginning. The atmosphere inside the bank had settled into a tense stillness, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just been realized, as every person present seemed to understand that the moment had shifted into something far more serious than a simple misunderstanding. Officer Ryan Blake stood at the center of it all, his posture still upright, his expression controlled, yet the certainty he once carried had begun to erode in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Evelyn Carter remained at the counter, her hands still resting calmly, her presence unchanged, yet now carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the space around her without effort. Marcus Reed stood near the entrance, his focus steady, his attention moving between the room and the man in the vest, as if confirming that everything was now proceeding exactly as expected. The man in the vest took a slow step forward, his gaze fixed on Ryan, his tone calm as he spoke again, asking questions that were no longer about identity alone, but about the situation that had unfolded in front of them. Ryan responded, his voice steady but measured, explaining his actions, his process, his reasoning, though each word now seemed to carry more weight than he intended. Around them, the customers remained silent, their earlier uncertainty now replaced with a quiet awareness that they were witnessing something that extended beyond the walls of the bank. Evelyn spoke again, her voice soft but clear, providing details that connected her presence to a larger context, each word carefully chosen, each sentence reinforcing a truth that was becoming harder to ignore. The man in the vest listened carefully, his expression unchanged, but his attention unwavering, as if every word confirmed what he had already suspected. Marcus shifted slightly, his posture relaxed, yet his presence remained firm, as though he understood that the outcome of this moment had already been decided. Ryan glanced briefly toward the entrance, then back to Evelyn, his mind processing the information he had been given, his understanding of the situation beginning to change in subtle but important ways. The teller remained still, her hands clasped, her eyes moving between each person in the room, her awareness growing as the reality of the situation became clearer. Evelyn's calm presence continued to define the moment, her composure unwavering, her silence just as powerful as her words. The man in the vest finally gave a slight nod, acknowledging the explanation, then turned his attention back to Ryan, his expression calm but firm, signaling that the next steps would be guided by a different level of authority. Marcus spoke once more, his voice steady, reinforcing the direction of the situation, not with pressure, but with certainty, as if confirming what had already been set in motion. Ryan stood still, his shoulders squared, his expression controlled, yet the tension in his stance revealed that he understood the gravity of what was unfolding. The room remained quiet, not out of fear, but out of respect for the moment, as if everyone understood that what came next would define the outcome of everything that had led to this point. Evelyn looked ahead, her gaze steady, her presence calm, as though she had already accepted the truth and the consequences that followed. And in that still, heavy silence, where no one spoke and no one moved without purpose, it became clear that the balance had shifted completely, and that the truth, once revealed, could no longer be contained or controlled by anyone in the room. The silence that filled the bank was no longer empty. It was full of meaning, as if every person inside had reached the same understanding without a single word needing to be spoken. Officer Ryan Blake stood still in the center of the room, his posture straight, his face composed, yet the confidence he once carried had been replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain. Evelyn Carter remained at the counter, her presence steady, her expression calm, her eyes reflecting a quiet truth that needed no explanation. Marcus Reed stood near the entrance, his gaze forward, his attention unwavering, as if he had already seen this moment unfold long before it arrived. The man in the vest took one final step forward, his presence calm but absolute, his voice steady as he spoke, not to challenge, but to conclude what had already been established. Ryan listened carefully, his response measured, his words careful, but there was no longer an attempt to dominate the moment, only to understand it. Around them, the customers remained quiet, their earlier tension now replaced with a sense of clarity, as they realized that what they had witnessed was not random, but meaningful. Evelyn finally shifted her gaze slightly, her voice calm as she spoke a few final words, not to defend, but but to confirm, each sentence reinforcing the truth that had been present all along. The man in the vest nodded once more, acknowledging her words, then turned his attention fully toward Ryan, his tone calm but firm as he stated the outcome in a way that left no room for confusion. Ryan stood still, absorbing the moment, his expression controlled, but his silence spoke more than any argument could have. The teller exhaled softly, her hands still clasped, her posture easing as the tension in the room began to settle. Marcus took a slow step back, his presence no longer needed to drive the moment, only to witness its completion. Evelyn remained where she stood, her calm presence unchanged, her strength defined not by force, but by certainty, as the room seemed to settle around her. The man in the vest gave a final look across the room, then signaled slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that the situation had reached its conclusion. Ryan lowered his hand from his radio, no longer reaching for authority, but accepting the reality of the moment with a quiet resignation. The room remained still, not from tension, but from the weight of what had just been resolved, as if everyone understood that something important had just come to an end. Evelyn looked ahead, her expression soft but steady, as though she had carried the truth into this moment and allowed it to stand on its own. Marcus turned slightly toward her, offering a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of what she had endured and what she had revealed. And in that final moment, as the room returned to stillness, it became clear that what had begun with doubt had ended in understanding, and that the truth, once allowed to speak, had done exactly what it was meant to do.